was announced a couple of days ago that a Korean team has been formed as the second team, at least temporarily, of MVP, the Korean organization. Going to be called MVP PK standing for Project KR, because that's where the core of this lineup comes from. And all of the names that were featured in this lineup are all old 1.6 players who all played at least within that core unit. In later years, it wasn't Project KR, it was at the very end again, but it was like over years, it was eSTRO, it was We Made Fox. Now, some of these names are more famous than others, but some of these players are some of the greatest Korean players ever, and indeed, a couple of them, some of the greatest players ever, particularly when we talk about solo. So the lineup of the team is Termi, Solo, Glow, Zeph, and Perry. Now, the quick overview is that the real core of the old school Project KR, which is the team that rose up from 2005 to become one of the best teams in the world from Korea, was Termi and Solo. Now, the third player who was the real part of the core was Bale. He's not involved in this. So Termi and Solo, they were there pretty much from the very beginning. Glow came into the mix in early 2009 because in the latter part of 2008, he'd been with Lunatic High, which was the other rival team, the other very good Korean team. But he wasn't in the Lunatic High that had the great results of the past. He wasn't in the Lunatic High that was second place at CPL Winter 2005 and top 8 at ESWC, etc. He wasn't in that Lunatic High. He was in the latter day one. But he joined in for 2009 onwards with the team as they went forwards from that. And Perry joined up in 2010. He actually joined just before Arbalete Cup Europe that year, so let's say around early spring, and he actually soon became one of the better players in the team. And Zeph was the last to join. He only joined in 2011 when the team was kind of fracturing. At that point in time, there was only about a year or so left of 1.6 as any kind of a legitimate game. And some of the others had to leave. People like Solo, Bale, I believe, went off to do their military service, because in Korea, once you reach a certain age, everyone is required to do mandatory military service, which doesn't always mean going into the battlefield and being a soldier. If you have some sort of physical defect, maybe, or injury, you might have to just go and be like a civil servant, essentially, a civil engineer or something, and just work in an office for a few years. But you can put it off for a while, and because pro gaming is a legit thing there, you can put it off for many years, as people like Solo and Termi did. But eventually, you've got to go and do it, as I believe Solo already has, and now he's returned. So these guys are returning in CSGO, and we haven't really seen them in CSGO. Like, Termi was the coach of the MVP team, the other MVP team in CSGO, but wasn't playing. But I was told by Kan Yang, a guy who used to organize the WEG tournaments and WEM tournaments back in Korea and China back in the mid-2000s, that actually Termi and Solo and a bunch of them had been playing matchmaking, and that they were globally on the Chinese servers. Now, interestingly enough, like I said, this is going to be the second team of MVP, because they already have a first team, which played at the Kesper PGL Korean, well, Asian minor actually, and they did pretty poorly, because that lineup was the one where it used to be Monster, and they rebranded it, made it MVP. And okay, it was the best Korean lineup, but that wasn't saying much, and they were beaten pretty easily and showed quite a poor understanding of the map. Now, the hope here is some of these are truly great 1.6 players, and some of these players dedicated themselves and overcame the sort of gap and disadvantage that they face now in CSGO back in 1.6, where they came up from being nobodies who had no one to compete against, had a very small scene, not very many people playing the game, especially not many people playing on Steam. Lots of people played on the cracked non-Steam version over there. So famously, they only had a very small pool of people to practice with, including playing with themselves. And so interestingly enough, the core of this team back in 1.6 used to be famous for having incredible pop flashes and flash executes. And what would happen is, I'll link a video up here for like a great strat that they did against MTW on Inferno. What they would do is they would just practice all day the execution of how to do these exact strats and make them as perfect as possible with this Korean work ethic and mentality. And so even if they weren't as amazing in all other aspects, they weren't as pedigreed and they weren't as tenured as some of the other teams they were facing in the West, this aspect made them one of the best in this particular area. And they were always very routine teams, and they had a number of players who were very skilled. So in terms of the history, I kind of went through it there, but I'll give you some of the more details. So if we go back to the Termi and Solo days, Solo was in the lineup long before Termi. He was actually in early 2005 when the first WEG tournament happened, and they finished very poorly there. Korea was a non-factor at the time. But by the end of the year, Termi gets involved, and now at WEG Season 3, WEG, by the way, World Esports Games, was a tournament that took place in Korea for the first 3 seasons, and you flew there, and you lived there for like a month and a half, and you played your games like one game every week or every few days in a studio that was like a television studio that would broadcast on Korean television. And so unlike other tournaments, it wasn't like 3 days and that's the whole LAN. You had time to prep for an opponent, to practice with each other, and to see how the team would adapt. And yes, a number of Western teams came. Not always the best Western teams until the later seasons, but some very skilled Western teams came over. NOA, later on we had NIP, we had the Big Rip that actually had Roban, tentpole of Forest in it. We had a number of Western teams go over. Natu's Finnish team went over. And we were able to see how they compete against each other. And interestingly, by WEG Season 3, the one where Toby joins up, this is when actually Asia very briefly had this big spike where already the other teams were doing well. Like, okay, we had Lunatic High placing second at CPL. Well, at this tournament, the Project KR lineup with Solo and Termi managed to finish second at the tournament, finishing ahead of NIP, finishing ahead of the Team 9 that was the Norwegian team with Real. And the only team they lost to in the tournament overall in terms of getting eliminated was WNV, the Chinese team, who very briefly went on to be the number one team. So in 2006, they made another player change. They got in a player that's, I don't even need to really reference it right now because it's not relevant to this video. They placed third at WEG Masters, which was an even more stacked tournament with a number of the Western teams. Pretty much most of the best teams attended that. Finishing third place there was big time stuff, ahead of many teams, including the SK team that had repeated the year before. But over the rest of the year, kind of like lackluster results. They never really lived up to the hype of what they'd done in Korea and China. And so at the time, people claimed, just like the Chinese team, WMV, like, oh, they're only good in Asia. They're not going to be as good in the West. Well, it seemed like that was the case initially. And they made another roster move towards the end of the year. And then in 2007, they were pretty lackluster early on. They were doing quite poorly. They came to ESWC in the West and France, didn't do well. But eSTAR's Seoul, which was like the sequel to the WEG tournaments, took place. They did very poorly there. They didn't win a map. And then actually, for a brief while, they were out of the game for a while because they became the Seoul Jinhua, which was the CGS franchise in Source, in Championship Gaming Series, which is that TV show in America where they had expanded all around the world, actually, in the first season as well. They still went to the World Cyber Games, but they only finished top 8 there. They actually ended up, unfortunately, losing to Emulate, who obviously went on to win the gold medal. Interesting enough, even finishing top 8 there was a little bit bullshit, because even on the group stage, they'd had a good run. They'd beaten a number of top teams, MIBR, Fnatic. Unfortunately, they only beat the MYM Norwegian team with Real, etc., through bullshit, where they essentially sort of like put pressure on WCG head admin type people, who some of the top people were Korean, so they could put this political pressure, and said that those players had done like crouch hopping, when actually some of the Korean players, including Solo, did crouching and hopping themselves. And there's no point going into all that aspect there. The point is, this wasn't like a great time in the team. But interestingly enough, towards the end of the year, they started to get it together and they started to become a bit more legit. They had a 5th place at IEM Los Angeles, where obviously there's a number of stacked teams. But in CGS, because they were playing CGS simultaneously, they did very poorly actually. They didn't do well there. 2008 was the interesting year because the Termi and Solo combo now had a fantastic year. They picked up a different player and they had one of the best years of all time. Like, I'll link down in the comments an article I wrote just about this year where they had an incredible run because they won $99,000, which in that year was the 4th most by any 5-man lineup. And actually, in the history of 1.6, is the 12th most won by a 5-man lineup ever in 1.6. So this was a great year. And in this year, part of winning that money mean that in the 3 majors, they finished top 3 in all of them. They finished 2nd place at IEM Season 2 finals. They were actually coming from the upper bracket and unfortunately were beaten by Mouse Sports coming from the lower bracket. They had 2nd place at ESWC where they played the Poles, MYM, but the Polish one with Neo and Taz, etc. And that was actually a 3-game series. All 3 games were really close. The 3rd one was on Tuscan, which the team actually hadn't played at the time. And they even lost that in narrow fashion 16-13. To get there, they'd beaten Fnatic in the semi-finals. To get the 2nd at IEM, they'd beaten a number of teams, SK, Fnatic, the Finns. They'd had an incredible run. At the time, they were showing off quite a high level. And obviously, these tournaments are in the West, crucially. Whereas, like I said, in the past, some of those other tournaments were in Asia, and it felt funky, especially because the Western teams were coming over, and they were adapting to, time zone changes, all the rest of that guff that could be used as an excuse. Now there was no excuse. They were performing an elite level in the West. There was the WEM tournament, which was the spiritual successor to WEG that took place in China. They finished 3rd there. They beat Fnatic again. They lost to Mouse Sports. They had the World Cyber Games, and this time they had their best run ever because they finished 3rd and won the bronze medal. And the only team they lost to was SK Gaming, the team that actually went on to win the silver medal that year. And they even lost that in a 3-map series, like a very close affair again. They beat the Norwegians for the bronze medal. And so they finished the year with a fantastic run at the majors and more good tournaments. Like towards the end of the year, there was an IEF tournament, which is a small Korean-only tournament. But Fnatic came over, and Fnatic had Forrest and Khan and DSN and all those guys, and they beat Fnatic again. And that was one of the interesting things about that year. Not only did they do a very legit run at the majors and their very legit tournament performance overall, despite not winning any big international tournaments, but not only did they play competitive games against all the top teams. Unfortunately, some teams like Mouse Sports were kind of their nemesis. But Fnatic, who was still one of the elite teams, one of the top 5 teams in the world, they actually beat them routinely again and again over this year, which is very incredible stuff because Fnatic was already one of the greatest teams of all time. I mean, the year before, 2007, Fnatic had been the best team. So then we came to 2009, And like I said, 2009 is when Glow comes into the mix over from Lunatic High. 2009 wasn't such a sick year. This was mainly the year where Europe was on top again. They had some okay finishes, but they were mainly sort of like 5th to 8th sort of finishes or higher finishes at like medium-sized lands that were only sort of like, 5 to 6 type teams competing there. They had one big run, which was at WEG eSTARS. They finished second place. Again, sort of their home tournament. This was in Korea. Had a good run there. They finished second behind Fnatic, because that was the year when Fnatic was very dominant when they'd gotten Get Right in. And as a result, they finished ahead of MTW DK, who'd been the best team of 2008. The Danish guys of Zonic and Trace and Ave, well, no, not Trace actually, Sunder at that point in time. But this year overall, again, this one was kind of like a down year. They'd been so good in 2008, in my opinion, one of the top 3, top 4 teams in the world. 2009 was more like going back into that 5th to 8th bracket where you're a dangerous, like upset merchant. Like you can definitely take maps off top teams. You can take them far in series. You can get the odd win, the odd series, but you're not getting top placings and you're not really in contention to win big titles. Now, what's interesting is 2010 rolls around, they get Perry into the mix, and when Perry comes in, they become a better team. But unfortunately, a lot of the tournaments in this year, they'd play really good games and they'd have good upsets and they'd come close to winning, but they'd lose tons of games, or even worse, they'd have leads and they'd tie games. And if you tied games in group stages, that could lead to nightmare scenarios where you just got fucked. And there was a bunch of times where they got fucked off, like ESWCs, etc. They did have a couple of good runs this year, though. One was, again, WEG eSTARS, their kind of home tournament. Again, they succeeded. This time they beat Fnatic in the semifinals, but the very good Fnatic. And they managed to get second place, losing to the Poles of Neo, etc. The Poles of Neo and Taz, etc. often were another team that held it over them to fight a few upsets from the Korean guys earlier on. The big moment when they won their one big international tournament was WEM, World Esports Masters, the spiritual successor to World Esports Games, and kind of in the circuit of World Esports Games eSTARS that took place that year. And this was in China, Hangzhou, China, and this was a super stacked tournament. It was fucking incredible, the teams here. And they managed to come from the lower bracket. First of all, they made it to the upper bracket final. They even beat the Poles, and they met SK Gaming there, who was using Delpan as a stand-in. I think as a stand-in for Roban, maybe? I think probably. And they lost there on Dust 2. So they come from the lower bracket, they beat the Poles again on Inferno, they get to the final. And they actually managed to win from the lower bracket to win the final. Interestingly enough, obviously the storyline of what had happened with Mouse Sports a few years earlier in 2008, when they'd been screwed over in the final themselves, they managed to win the big event. It was an incredible affair. There one big time where they kind of came through on it. In fact, I'll put an article down there if I remember, which was an article about this time where they finally, they stopped being the bridesmaids, they became the bride, they won the tournament. This was the big crowning moment for them. And I know even years later, I heard some stories from some of the people who were managers, like Termi, etc. They used to watch the videos of this back and realize this was like the one moment where they'd really come good and had a fantastic performance. Now, in 2011, like I said, by then, things had fallen off a little bit. Some of the players had to go to the army. They weren't having top placings anymore. Zeph came in. He wasn't a particularly sick player at the time. He was just an average player and didn't really have that much of an influence on the team. Now, in terms of the players themselves, Termi is like the traditional support player. If you think of the support player in CSGO, he's like that in CS 1.6, except in CS 1.6, it wasn't as aim predicated. So you could use positioning better, you could use team play better, you could use this precise flash better. And so as a result, his job was, he was just the veteran. He was just there the whole time behind stars like Solo and Bale and Glow. And he was just the guy there to fill in the holes and be the glue guy and do anything that was needed and be a team player. And he did a solid job of that. He was never a strong player individually, but he did a very solid job of that. And it doesn't surprise me, he's the one who went on to become the coach later. Solo was the superstar of this team. Not just the star, superstar. When this guy was on form, 2005, and then later, 2007, 2008, he got very good again. 2010, he was still pretty solid, but not superstar in the whole world. In his peaks of play, he was a top 5 player in the world. For all time, he's certainly a top 20 individual player of all time in 1.6. He might even be top 10. I've never actually done that list. I'll probably do it at some point. So I'd really have to think it through. But he had phenomenal talent. I mean, he really could do everything. He was like the Korean Neo. He could AWP if he wanted to. He had a godlike rifles. He had amazing pistols. He had an aggressive style of play. He had a passive style of play. He read the game very well. He had a lot of confidence, despite the fact he's coming from Korea and he's not getting very much practice against. But he could go against these godlike players and he could have fantastic performances. And his big performances were a huge part of what made them really good in the first place at the end of 2005, and he always was one of the best players that helped elevate the team over and over again. Interestingly enough, of the other players, I definitely have to say Glow is an interesting player because he was never a star player, but he was more, to me, like an NBK type player. Like he had the skill to be one of your better players, but he probably shouldn't be your best player. And if he wants to, at certain times, he can play more of a stable role, while other players like Bale and Solo have the sick games. He can play the stable role and win the clutches for you. For me, he was at his best when he was getting like 1 to 2 kills in a round and he would win a 1v1 type clutch. Now, there is a video that I'll link up here when he first burst on the scene in this team, where when they had that run to the final of WEG eStars 2009, man alive, to beat SK Gaming in this tournament, he had a godlike performance on Nuke. One of the sickest demos I've ever seen. It's linked up there, and he has a couple of rounds in this where he just wins 1v3s and 1v4s, and he wins like 1v3 where he just spams from outside a wall bang onto where the bomb is and kills 2 people, then comes in and kills the 3rd. His timing and his intuitive sense for this stuff was very good. Like he's one of those guys who would trust his instincts and win rounds as a result of it. Not the most godlike skill player, but a skilled rifler nonetheless. And so he was a very interesting guy because he did come over from the rivals Lunatic High, who really were like, that was like a Liverpool-Everton scenario. You didn't go from one team to the other in theory. So the fact that he came over was interesting when he kind of seemed like he was going to be the future of Lunatic High at one point in time. Certainly was one of the key aspects to be allowing this team to like kind of revitalize themselves after losing some of their other players and go forwards in time and become a force to be reckoned with again. And obviously he was part of the lineup that won the WEM, the one big international tournament they won. Now, Perry, like I said, came around in 2010. He was one of the better players. He was an explosive rifler, pretty steady aim as well. But he wasn't some like super monster. He wasn't what Solo was at his peak. But he was one of the better players in the team, and he's certainly skilled enough to go against a bunch of the Europeans. Maybe not the gods like Forrest and Neo, etc. But he was right up there. He was certainly a solid player, and he was part of the last revitalization of the team. Where before that they'd had a player called LSW. Garcia, who, he was a bit crap actually. He was just like one of those crouch and spray in a massive pattern type guys. Never really that impressed with him as a player. Now, Zeph, as I said, was just the guy who joined at the end when there was no one else to recruit pretty much. They just got him in, didn't really show a whole lot. So in terms of these players, you can see it's a really wide spread there. And the players actually cover the whole history of the team, going back to Project KR, Hacker PK, into eSTRO, which was the best period. Then We Made Fox, which was still pretty good. And at the end, they were Project KR again when they had no sponsors left. Like I said, one of the interesting things was they had this very small culture, and it never got huge. Counter-Strike never got huge in Korea, because even the people who played Counter-Strike, like I said, didn't play the Steam version. They'd play the non-Steam versions. You couldn't really practice against them. They had an incredibly small community. But these guys worked hard. I mean, you can compare it to some sense to the storyline, like I've said in the past, of Luminosity, where they used to work super hard, and then when they got their chances, they made the most of them. And just like the Brazilian teams, this team would also go and do boot camps. So as the 1.6 Brazilian teams used to come to Inferno Online in Sweden, the LAN cafe, and practice all the Europeans for a week or so before massive tournaments, that's what these Koreans would try to do sometimes. And with the Korean work ethic, if you know anything about that, they would put in hard hours at the Inferno Online and just go completely ham, playing deathmatch all the time, playing bots all the time, playing against any team they could get to scrim against all the time, and that's how they got their level up and were able to peak for these big tournaments. So I don't know if they'll be a good team in CSGO. Probably not, right? It's probably unreasonable to think that right now. But when you consider Tyloo's become pretty decent, we have had the Brazilians get better. If they can get the funding from someone, if they can go to a few tournaments and show themselves, maybe get into a major qualifier or something, at least some of these players, it only takes 1 or 2 to become pretty decent before we can start to get something interesting going on. It's hard to believe they'll all become good because CSGO hasn't really worked like that from 1.6, but I think it's at least an interesting story, especially because of the history of the team. And actually, I'll probably do some more historical content about some of the lineups in the past of this team or some of the players of this team. But for now, I just want to keep this as like a primer for them because Solo, very, very important player in 1.6 history. Solo and Termi accomplished a lot. Glow and Perry there for the latter end, where they were able to win a big international tournament over, the likes of SK, Na'Vi, Fnatic, Evil Geniuses, the Poles. I mean, this is big time shit. So yeah, Korea might not be relevant now in CSGO. In fact, it isn't at all. It's one of the least relevant places. But it wasn't at the beginning for the first 2 to 3 years of 1.6, which wasn't obviously 1.6 at the very beginning. But it became more relevant. At one point in time, it became very relevant. And at one point in time, had a top 3, top 4 in the whole team in the whole world. So certainly an interesting story and development of a scene, thanks to the work ethic and certain godlike talents like Solo.